Alright guys, this is Chapter 12, Deliberation of the Jury and Verdict. So, we've made it through the entire court process. We started off with a person committing a crime, why we have laws. Then we talked about law enforcement and restrictions to their job, meaning, protections like Fourth Amendment, things like that. Then we talked about the initial hearing, and then we talked about motions, and we talked about the actual trial, and now we have made it all the way to the end of the trial when the jury is actually going to make a decision as to whether or not a person is guilty. So they're given instructions. When the judge gives a jury instructions at the end of a court hearing, that is called charging the jury. I might ask that as a question. So yeah, after the hearing, after the trial is over and everybody has had their closing statements and everybody's rested, and the case now goes into the jury's hands, and the judge gives them instructions, and that is called charging them. Blah blah blah. We talked about this before, the Fifth Amendment, but consciousness of guilt, the jury will be informed that the defendant has a right not to testify. And just because the defendant does not testify on their own behalf does not mean that the jury is allowed to consider that they are guilty. Comments by the judge. Some states will allow judges to kind of give their opinion on some of the testimony and the evidence. I think that's probably, I've never seen it happen in California, but apparently about half states do allow for this. Inside a jury room, typically the jury is going to all go back into a room together, and a foreperson will be chosen. The jury, the group of people back there, the actual jury, they're the ones that are going to pick that foreperson. It's not like the judge tells so-and-so you have to be the foreperson. The jury will make that decision. And a lot of times what they're going to do is, as soon as they get back there, pick a foreperson. They're typically going to be guarded by a bailiff or a sheriff's deputy. And they're going to do a vote. And they're going to say, how many of you think right now that he's guilty? And how many of you think right now that he's not guilty? And it's kind of a starting point for them. They're allowed to have their notes that they could take during the trial. And they can have any evidence that was used during the trial. Those are the only things they can really have in the jury room. They can't have, their phones. They can't have news reports. They can't have any other outside information in that jury room. How long is too long? A jury who cannot agree on a verdict is referred to as a hung jury. Okay. So typically, the jury's going to work together for whatever period of time. It might be a few days before they come back to the judge and say, we don't think that we can come to an agreement. This comment here, Allen charge, basically the judge is going to order them back to the jury room and make them try a little bit longer to see if they can come up with an unanimous decision. But a hung jury is what's known as a group of people who cannot agree on a verdict. Example, it was the first time Bill Cosby was tried. During his first trial, there was a hung jury. They could not come to a decision, so the court ordered a mistrial, and the jury got to go home, and that was the end of it. They could not agree. Most verdicts must be unanimous. Okay, so I'm just going to stick with that and move on. If it's a death penalty, every state says it has to be unanimous. And by unanimous, I mean all the jurors have to agree. You can't have, 11-1. It's got to be 12-0. All have to agree, and that's a unanimous case. A bench trial is a little bit different than a jury trial. Well, it's a lot different than a jury trial. The trial part is the same, but in a bench trial, instead of a jury making the decision on the verdict, it's a judge. And I think we talked about this before. There are instances where you might want to have a judge hear your case as opposed to a jury. And those might be times, emotional types of cases, maybe sex offenses. Unfortunately, judges hear about sex offenses all the time. Your typical jury member, your typical average citizen like you or me, doesn't hear about those all the time. So the emotions could kind of take over, and you might be better off having a judge hear the case as opposed to a jury. But a bench trial is when the judge decides a verdict. A jury trial is when a jury decides the verdict. And the term verdict comes from the Latin word verdictum, meaning a true declaration. After the verdict is announced, good God, I've been home too long. After the verdict is announced, the prosecution or defense may request that jurors be polled individually to see how each one voted. Okay, so this is sometimes kind of an intimidation tactic where each juror has to actually say out loud on the record in court how they found. This does happen sometimes. Yes, okay, so we talked about a hung jury. That's a jury that cannot make a decision. If there is a hung jury, there can be a new trial, which is exactly what happened in Bill Cosby's case. Or there is a chance that the prosecution might choose not to retry the case. Also here it says mistrial may be rendered at any time during the trial. It doesn't have to be a hung jury. There can be other reasons why there might be a mistrial. But anyways, blah, 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 oral sentencing, blah, 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 summary. Okay. Typically, after a verdict is announced, let's say that the jury has come back and said, and actually this Corey Muhammad case is still going on right now while we are at home quarantined. I believe this jury just went back this week. Today's May, April, who knows what day it is. It's April 21st. So his jury just went back yesterday to deliberate. But once the jury comes back and there is a finding, guilty, not guilty, whatever, if the person is found guilty, then sentencing will be the next step. And typically, sentencing will be continued for about a month so that the probation officer can write a pre-sentence investigation report. So I think we're going to be done with this part. This is kind of a little summary. We talked about charging the jury. We talked about mistrial, hung jury. I think we're good to go.